Hi, I'm Professor Green, and today we'll be talking about Chapter 16, Global Marketing and Business Analytics. So just two more chapters in the textbook and for this course. Let's go ahead and get started. Learning objectives, understanding the importance of business analytics and international market research. So we've talked a little bit in this course already about research and market research and how important it is for a company to invest in making sure that they're making the right decisions. So we'll go a little bit deeper into and how this works and how all the numbers come together. Explain why it might make sense to vary the attributes of a product from country to country. Again, a little bit of a review from earlier in this course, right? How things are often regionalized. Recognize why and how a firm's distribution strategy might vary among countries, right? Not only could the product be different, but you might distribute it differently, big supermarkets, smaller supermarkets, etc. Goes on. Identify why and how advertising and promotional strategies might vary among countries. This brings to mind that Benetton ad that we saw a couple of years ago with a mother breastfeeding. Huge ad, in their windows or on billboards of a woman breastfeeding her baby, and no problem in France, no problem in Europe, but in America, it's a little bit of taboo to watch women breastfeeding still. Explain why and how a firm's pricing strategy might vary among countries, right? That sometimes things are more expensive in different countries. That's why I shipped my car when I moved to Switzerland a couple of years ago, because cars are just so much more expensive in Europe. And that's okay. If the companies can do that, that works for them. But when I had the opportunity to ship my car, it made it a little bit more sense. Understand how to configure the marketing mix globally. So now taking that marketing mix that you used in and learned about in your marketing class, and that we'll review again here today, and how to adjust that for the global market. I think a really interesting twist on it all. And then lastly, describing how globalization is affecting product development in the true R&D, and how organizations might have different R&D departments throughout the world, and how those departments then can work together. So let's go ahead and get started. You'll also notice that I am back from the Czech Republic. Same outfit, right? I've cleaned my clothes, different outfit, different white turtleneck, but a little bit extremely jet lagged. So a real international business case for me personally today. So let's talk about Coke. Right, it's one of the most recognizable brands in the world, sold in over 200 countries. They have this original idea of selling happiness in a bottle, but the case tells us that they were dropping in market share. There were so many other competitors, Pepsi, Fanta, Sprite, local sodas, etc. So they wanted to go ahead and create a new, not necessarily a new product, but a new way to represent the product. And so in Australia, their ad agency there decided to test this campaign with sharing a Coke. And they were able to put people's names, that they took the top 100 or so names in Australia and put them on the Cokes. And then you could either buy it for yourself or buy it for a friend. And it was amazingly successful. It really took that idea of happiness to a new level. They've now shared this ad over 80 countries and in 7 years. And what I thought was super interesting was that it was an opportunity for consumers to express themselves, which is a huge thing these days, right? People with social media and just the way we are in this generation, we really feel a need to express ourselves and have that freedom to do that. And also share that experience with someone else, especially because we can get so often isolated because we depend on social media sometimes for our outlets. And especially now at the pandemic, we can get isolated. Having those shared experiences is more and more valuable. So that ad agency probably spent a lot of time with focus groups and understanding what are the needs of today, and how can we meet those needs with our brand. They even localized the product at a country level, right? They did for the UK, they did, welcoming the royal baby, and they put the royal baby's names on from when Kate Middleton had her first two children, they put their names on the can of Coke, and people are crazy about the British. So another way for them to connect, feel heard, and share that happiness. So again, really nice way to illustrate how you take one product that's been around for decades and now shifting it for different markets. So that's exactly what we're going to talk about today: global marketing, business analytics, which is highly linked to marketing, and R&D. How do they find out what are the best new ideas for this product? And then because the author puts all these things together because he feels that marketing has a job to find out what people want and then communicate that to R&D to develop a product that people are needing or wanting. So we see here that, it can reduce costs of value creation and add value by better serving the needs in the global marketplace. And this also includes distribution strategy, as I mentioned in the learning outcomes, that it's not just the product itself that we try to localize at times, but it's how we get that product to the person. We're going to talk more about that in this chapter. Also, mass production of a standardized product can generate unit cost reductions, yes, but ignoring country differences and consumer taste can lead to failure, as we've seen many, many times. The biggest example, that the traditional one, it's almost cliche now to talk about Disney. My dad talked to me about this before I went to Thunderbird, and one of the reasons why I studied international business, because he said that when Disney opened up their park in Paris, they were shocked that everybody wanted to eat lunch at noon or 1 o'clock. Here in the United States, the restaurants are open all day long, and they can spread the lunchtime over the whole entire day. We eat all day long. But in Europe, people are really set on eating at 12 or 1. And then they don't eat again until 6 or something like this. And so when they opened up Paris, it was a catastrophe because all the restaurants were slammed at that time. They weren't expecting so many people at that time, and then were empty for the rest of the day. And so they really had to adjust then how they served their market when they went to Paris. We'll talk about this also in this course, but I can't wait to talk to you about it, in that the world, yes, is becoming globalized, because you might say, oh, like my cousin in Europe has the same ideas that I do and we're the same age. Yes, but not everything and not every place. And so just remember that the world, yes, is becoming more globalized, but it remains different in many ways. Younger people, yes, want more similar products worldwide, but people over 40, and I fortunately or unfortunately I'm in that age group, we might be sticking still to things that we grew up with and might want something more traditional to our home location. So let's talk about another slide here with the introduction, focusing more on the marketing function. This identifies gaps in the market. Again, why marketing is so important, because it identifies where a firm can potentially develop these new markets to fill those gaps. And as I said, we're going to talk a lot about the marketing mix. So the choices the firm offers to its target market. So what are the product attributes? How do you get that to that person? How do you talk about that product? And then how do you price that product, right? So the marketing mix. Product, place, promotion, and pricing, the 4 Ps of marketing, which hopefully sounds very familiar by this point in your MBA. So let's now talk about globalization of markets and brands. We can't go any further without talking about Theodore Levitt, because he was an author in the Harvard Business Review in 1983, and he came up with what was revolutionary almost at the time, saying that world markets are becoming increasingly similar, making it unnecessary to localize the marketing mix. It was kind of a new idea that we could have the same exact product from country to country. And I might not have been born in 1983, but I remember this explicitly because that was the year that I started to travel, be more aware of these things with my family. Even in the late 80s, I'd go to Switzerland, and And the products were just still so different. The music was still so different. But as time went on, we could very quickly see that the products became more and more similar. Music now is the same. It gets released globally. I was just in Europe last week and amazed to see the Avatar movie opening actually a couple days ahead in the Czech Republic of opening up here in the United States. So really things are changing. And this may be true for bulk industrial products, but not necessarily for consumer products. So that's what this chapter will talk about. Yes, Theodore Levitt was correct, but not completely correct. Even 30 years later now, we are still working through this idea and this theory. Consumers may prefer the local options if they exist, and we'll talk more about this and how that maybe is more consistent in developing countries versus developed countries. Trade barriers and differences in product technical standards also limit the ability of firms to sell a standardized product. So again, you can see already the author is telling us that these trade barriers make it harder for organizations to standardize their products and take advantage of economies of scale. And that is true when we have open borders like between Mexico and Canada. We can move products much more easily. And then it has become, as Theodore Levitt is saying, increasingly similar. And to say that, yes, we have McDonald's in every country almost these days. But even McDonald's, says that Theodore Levitt is not exactly right, because they do modify, right, the menu from country to country. As we'll talk about in Islamic countries, they can't have something called a hamburger on the menu because it talks about ham, even though it's not really ham. Because, right, Islamic countries don't eat ham, so they have to change it to a different name. And even potentially the recipe as well. Also, technological forces are leading us closer to global consumer cultures. So again, this is going back to what Levitt was saying, as you'll see in this chapter, we flip back and forth, we seesaw back and forth between these ideas that, right, because of social media, things can move across borders so much faster because of the internet, right? When I was a child, it took weeks for a film actually to go to Europe because you had to put it on an actual film and ship it. Now you just send a file and it's abroad. So let's keep talking about this exciting chapter. Market segmentation. How do we break down a market? This is identifying distinct groups. So when you start to create a product and market it, advertise it, then you want to think about, okay, who am I advertising to? And then you might want to break it down by geography, maybe, by demography, maybe, social cultural factors, and psychological factors. So this identifies what the consumer needs, wants, and purchasing behaviors, how they differ from group to group. Also, we should just bring up the idea that maybe people are engaging with global brands, just like McDonald's or Coke or Nike. But sometimes the way these brands are perceived and can be used can be different. That, for example, Levi's is a good one. Up until like the last 10 years or so, Levi's was like some big name in Europe. People loved Levi's. They spent $100 for a pair of Levi's in Europe. They would come to the United States and stock up. But here in the United States, Levi's are like the workman's pants, definitely not the same. And we can buy them for $30. So really interesting to see, right, how one brand potentially can be perceived differently in country to country. Just want to make sure I didn't skip anything on this. Oh, right. So talking about these social cultural factors. An example here is that the people in China age 65 to 80. Yeah, even though the younger generation, right, is on social media, on the internet, etc., getting the messages and ideas from the US relatively quickly. But the aging demographic, they're highly sensitive to price and new products. And why is that? Is because they grew up during the Chinese Cultural Revolution, and that they have different ideas. They grew up with this idea that they didn't want to, they potentially are poor, or they grew up poor, and so they didn't, that's often the case when people are poor. They're very sensitive to changes in price, and also they're very connected to their products. And so again, you can't generalize necessarily for all of China. You might sometimes have to break it down by age group. Let's get into the next slide before I talk too much about that. Market segmentation in foreign countries. So firms must adjust their marketing mix from segment to segment. They must be aware of differences between countries in the structure of the market segments, as I've been mentioning. They have to consider intermarket segments that transcend national borders. And this is predicted to be more common. This I think of very often because I'm from Switzerland, from the German part of Switzerland. And very often the products that we get in the German part of Switzerland are the same products that you get in Germany and in Austria, but not necessarily in the French part of Switzerland, right? Because we share a language. And so the culture can be somewhat similar. And so they will group those three areas together. When I started to market films, when I was in film sales for a handful of years, when I first moved to Los Angeles, I marketed feature films, and we would always sell to a distributor who did the Germanic countries, or we'd also include Belgium as well, because some people speak German in Belgium. Also, there are different countries that speak Arabic, all Arabic. They're all different countries with their own culture, etc. But they would be one distributor for like all the Arabic countries very often. So, so we need to consider the intermarket segments that transcend national borders. This is predicted to be more common, right? Because the young people are being able to see products the same across borders. The global youth segment suggests that there are common values among teens around the world. And another example that I want to give was Toyota. They need to adjust their product and their advertising. Toyota is the umbrella company also for Lexus as well. So they will sell Lexus really only in developed countries where people recognize and appreciate luxury and high-end cars. But in more developing countries, they probably won't enter with Lexus very often. They'll be more pushing their Toyota Corolla model. While here in the United States, that's actually, a small market for the Corolla. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide, business analytics. So now moving less away from traditional marketing and more into business analytics and how we get that information to help provide the marketers the information for creating new products. This is the knowledge, skills, and technology that allow for the exploration of a company's international strategies to drive future development and implementation. It begins with what's called a data set. I was a business analyst for a number of years. Makes a lot of sense, right? Because I like international business. And what the book said, I find is true, that what the data set is usually depends on the skills of the analyst to help guide the type of data being collected and the skills and experience of the data analyst. So, and that also sometimes dictates a P&G or a large organization which research company they will choose, because they're looking for a particular type of data and looking for analysts with that experience. Sometimes we talk about big data, right? Which was a big deal maybe 10 years ago already, but now it's so normalized. Big data is now stored on a large scale server, and people specialize with this, stored on a cloud, etc. There are three core applications of data: descriptive analytics, predictive analytics, and prescriptive analytics. So descriptive analytics is more like elementary. We can say like you're looking for maybe the demographic data of people who go to Starbucks in a small town in Sweden, as the book talks about. So are they female? What type of education do they have? Basic information. Then we would move on to the next level of predictive analytics. This is how social media potentially will change the coffee sold. So if you start, then you can start to, change a piece of your communication strategy, whether it be social media or billboard or whatever it might be. But let's say Starbucks, because it's mostly social media. And if you change, if you create an ad campaign, will that change the amount of coffee sold over a 2-week period, for example? And then the last one is the prescriptive analytics, and these are for the real Excel nerds out there, but really a very lucrative and exciting field. This is to help identify which type of advertising now will help change the coffee sold, right? So even if within social media, what type of ad, are you targeting men? Or are you targeting women? Or maybe you are going to do some ads in the local newspaper, or maybe you're going to do Instagram over Facebook, etc. So this helps organizations decide what type of how to configure their marketing mix, obviously. International marketing research. Again, all these slides are so interesting, and a world that is quickly developing, very lucrative. It's definitely a rabbit hole that people can spend decades exploring. I highly recommend it if anybody's ever interested in this field, because there's definitely money to be made in the future. So the international marketing research, this is a systematic collection, recording, analysis, and then interpretation of the data. Probably if you'd already done some of this in business school. All firms want some basic data. They want data on country and potential market segments. You'll be doing this for your projects if you haven't already. Data to forecast customer demands within a specific area, and data to make marketing mix decisions, obviously. So what are the international market research steps? Just to break it down, these are, in my mind, somewhat logical. I hope they're logical for you too. Defining the research objectives, right? Sometimes that can be really vague, and I feel like people sometimes are surprised about that, right? That, P&G wants to know, they want to sell their shower gel now in France. So they want to know, who would be who's buying shower gel in France, right? And so that's kind of a vague idea, but then it'll take weeks to kind of dial down as to, getting that data. But what you have to start first is saying, okay, I want to know more about who's buying shower gel in France. Okay. Then you move on to determining the data sources. How am I going to get that data? You can use either primary or secondary research. And I think people often forget about primary research. I'm such a fan. Primary research is interviewing experts. I can do that all day long, right? Going to conferences, finding out who the expert is in that area, doing surveys. Also a big fan that I did my master's degree in communications. We focused a lot on, the wording in surveys, the timing of surveys, the lengths of surveys. There's a real science that goes into creating a survey. Focus groups, another one of my favorites. I led a handful of different focus groups, and that's really exciting to get people talking about what they want. And, after 45 minutes or an hour, really, you're able to get deep into their psyche and to understand what is their true motivation for buying this product. I led a focus group once on annual pass holders, or one of my professors did it, but he told us about it. Annual pass holders at Disneyland in Southern California, and who those people are. And I didn't know this, but they're mostly Hispanic, lower income. And you think, oh my gosh, who can afford an annual pass for $1,000 a year? And it's because that's where they put all of their money, right? They don't necessarily go on vacation into different countries, et cetera, or travel, but what they do with their vacation time is then they get a little bang for their buck when they go to Disneyland. And that is because once they walk into those gates, the world and their worries disappear. It's a place of true happiness, and they feel like they can escape And so those are the people that need it and use it. So that's all primary research. Then secondary research is great too, right? Looking for articles and people who've done this research for you a lot cheaper. That moves us into the next one, assessing the costs and benefits of the research. So how much money do you have to do the research? And that really will determine if you're going to do primary or secondary research. Collecting the data, going out and finding the data, doing your interviews if that's something that you want to do, analyzing and interpreting the data. This is like a true scientist in my mind. These are people who are familiar with SAS, SPSS is another tool. Also, you want people on board to help interpret cultural and knowledge. Cultural and language knowledge, because you might be translating your surveys. You want to when you get things back, you want to make sure you're interpreting it properly. So really getting somebody on board who understands the culture and where you're going to be implementing the product. And then reporting the research findings. And this is, more important than one would think, because you've, spent thousands, millions, maybe dollars of doing this whole process. And then you want to make sure that the people are on board who will hear it and properly hear it and understand it. That we had a mistake with Toyota in Japan, that when they had an issue with their accelerator pads in one of their models, they kind of were embarrassed. And so they kind of pushed it under the rug. And then when they did do a little bit of research, they were again embarrassed to report to senior management that this was a flaw and this had gotten through the system. And they were afraid to disclose this bad news, right? Because if we talked about in this course, some of these Asian cultures, it's all about reputation and saving face. And it really was a failure at the end of the day, because they did not bring these issues to top management right away, and the issue became bigger and bigger. So some of the firms to help collect and analyze the data, or collect the data, I should say, is J.D. Powers, Nielsen, Ipsos out of Paris. So a lot of great organizations that spend millions of dollars finding out that information for you. Product attributes. Maybe some of you are really excited about creating new product, right? I have a good girlfriend from childhood that I have talked about, I think, who does fragrance design. She has her undergrad in marketing and her master's from the Fashion Institute of Technology, specifically in fragrance design. And so really understanding, they call her the nose, because she goes around and she sniffs lots of different perfumes and she decides which attribute should go into that perfume. So products can be viewed as a bundle of different attributes. Products sell well when attributes match the consumer needs. So she, ever since we were children, she was really good at identifying what the consumer's needs were. She was always the best at buying birthday gifts, because she has a skill to tune in and understand the consumer and then match that with a product. The consumer needs vary from country to country, depending on the culture and the levels of economic development, as I've alluded to a little bit already in this chapter. And the ability to sell the product worldwide here, and the author is saying, is limited. We're going to talk about 5 constraining factors in the next couple of slides. Really interesting to see that BMW has kind of isolated themselves in many ways, that they really have moved forward to only selling in high income areas, countries, because they're a luxury product. They have decided not to focus on lower grade models. So just an example of how they decided not to sell worldwide. So we have cultural differences. What are the 5 major cultural differences? Tradition, social structure, language, religion, education. These are all hopefully sounding familiar. There's a picture here of a vending machine of coffee in Japan called Georgia, right? So how super interesting how the US markets have encouraged the Japanese to move away from tea in recent decades. And now the Japanese are can be very much more into coffee as well, which maybe 3 decades ago, we would never think that that would be the case. Another one about tradition, also about Japan. I thought that was so interesting. Pledge, wood furniture polish. When they first introduced that in Japan, it wasn't taking off and they didn't really know why. And then they did primary research, probably a focus group or something. And they got to understand that actually the smell reminded the people who were using it of a disinfectant that had been used for decades in latrines. And so people didn't want to use it because they were reminded of that and they didn't want to have that smell in their home. So let's go ahead and jump into the next slide. We have 2 more slides and then I'll end this section. Economic development. So as I said a couple of slides ago, how that affects your marketing mix. So consumers in highly developed countries tend to demand a lot of extra performance attributes in their products, right? BMW has met that demand. Consumers in less developed nations tend to prefer more basic products, right? They want cars, maybe not necessarily with air conditioning or electric windows. And so contrary, as I said, we're going to seesaw with Levitt's ideas, this whole chapter. Contrary to his suggestions, consumers in most developed countries are not willing to sacrifice preferred attributes for lower prices. So even though I could go down to CarMax today and get a cheap car with no air conditioning and no electronic windows, there's obviously no way that I would do that, right? Because I've gotten so used to having these things. And even though it's more expensive, I really do demand these things. So product and technical standards, this one is close to home for me because my stepdad made a lot of money in the 1980s by helping the advertising industry translate or convert, is really the word convert, the ads in the United States. We used VHS at the time, if you remember that term, to the type of film that they were using in Europe called Beta. And he made a lot of money helping the ad agency move their commercials from the US to Europe. He was from the Czech Republic and he was an engineer. And so he was a really good fit for understanding how to close these gaps. So what this is that let's go backwards to forwards. Differing technical standards limit the globalization of markets. So, right, the technical standard was different, VHS to Beta. So where there was less of an opportunity to globalize the market. Differing government mandated standards can force companies to rule out mass production and constrain globalization of markets. Yes, that's exactly what happened. But regional trade agreements may influence certain regional markets to become more globalized. And so sometimes, as I said earlier, because we're able to move these products more easily, which is really what's happening now with the technology, that no longer do we have this issue with DVDs, even though there are limited trade agreements between the U.S. and Europe. We definitely can move files across borders, but this is really talking about making sure that we can get products between Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. a little bit easier. So so hopefully you've enjoyed this section, and it all makes sense, right? That technical product and technical standards is a big piece of this all, and how that is closing the gap when we move to a more centralized idea of technology. Great, I'm going to go ahead and end part 1, and I will see you in a minute for part 2.